Afternoon all. I'd like to show the absolutely fantastic Game 11 of the 1992 Fischer Spassky Match played in Belgrade in the former Yugoslavia. Fischer kicked off with e4. Spassky replied with the Sicilian Defence. After knight f3 we see knight c6. So is this an invitation for the dreaded Sicilian Sveshnikov? Well, an anti-Sveshnikov move is played now, which is very, very popular nowadays. Bishop b5. So white threatens to damage black's pawn structure. Spassky plays one of the most popular moves actually, which is just to ignore that by playing g6. Black hopes to establish good control over the d4 square in this sort of position. If taking on c6, black can sometimes play either d takes c or b takes c. D takes c also helps control of d4 if the fianchetto is covering d4 as well. It reinforces that central control. In fact, we see though Fischer taking immediately and Spassky electing b takes c6. This is an alternative, a very good alternative to d takes c6, and has some perks with it. Now Fischer castled and we see bishop g7. In this position, after rook e1, it looks as though black has quite a cozy position in the centre, good grip over the d4 square, and Spassky reinforces that grip by playing e5. Not moving the knight yet means actually that knight e7, and if left alone, this kind of setup, black would have the bishop pair and a very strong central control, and later could even look forward to moves like f5. So it looks very dangerous, this setup, but the whole system is interrupted here. In fact, white plays a very dynamic move in this position. White plays b4. Fischer sacrifices a pawn, kind of a wing gambit. So how is it effective in this particular position? Well, it is taken. Black doesn't clearly want to play something like d6. It would look dreadful for the pawn structure. Fragmentation like this. Isolated pawn here, double pawns here. This is not what black wants. So black wants to keep a reasonable pawn structure here. He does take the pawn, and now after a3, it's some difficult decision needs to be made here for black. For the greedy b takes a3, in fact, white has very good compensation for the pawn here. After taking this pawn, although a pawn down, white is looking forward to quite a powerful move now, knight c4 in this position. This is actually, let's put on the kibitzer. It's actually the stronger move than bishop takes a3, apparently, because on bishop a3 d6, and this knight is not such a good piece in this position. It hasn't got the d5 square. So actually the key move would seem to be knight takes a3. And for example, how this is uncomfortable for black, knight e7, knight c4, now threatening knight d6 check and bishop a3. These are very, very powerful ideas. If black castles bishop a3 and putting a bishop on d6 can lead to complete domination of the dark squares in this position. For example, rook e8, knight d6, that's very, very unpleasant. This kind of position, there's such a grip on the dark squares, it gives white more than adequate compensation. And look at this miserable bishop on c8. So here, this is actually quite a tricky position for black to do anything constructive. If a5, then bishop d6, and there's great compensation for the pawn again. For example, in fact, white can just take this e5 pawn now and not even be material down, just a very dominating position. So this is very, very tricky after a3 if black does take on a3. In fact, Spassky elected for c5, one of the better tries. Now Fischer plays a takes. After c takes, there's actually a potentially good viable alternative here to what was played, which is c3. This seems to offer white good compensation as well for the pawn. In fact, my engine assistant Houdini actually likes white very much in this sort of position, either with d6 or knight e7, believe it or not. There seems to be very strong compensation in this type of position here. For example, like this. Again, this idea of putting a bishop on d6, it's a huge grip on the dark squares, and e5 is vulnerable to be taken off next move as well. This kind of position is to be avoided for black. So it's a far cry from the dream which Spassky might have had earlier. So all stemming from this gambit. Let's go back. So after this move d4, after a takes, pardon me, after a takes, c takes, this move c3 is viable, but Fischer actually doesn't play c3, he plays d4. Okay, and this, after e takes d4, black has got a lot of pressure to deal with after bishop b2. Spassky tries in this position d6. Now your question might be, well, surely black should be developing his knight on g8 here instead of playing d6. Well, let's see some alternatives here. If knight e7, then bishop takes d4, and the problem is this b4 pawn is a bit loose. It can be collected. For example, if castles, we can take on g7. Just connect the pawn with queen d4 check and queen takes b4. And white's grip again on the dark squares is good. There's a backward pawn on d7. There's an isolated pawn here. White overall is standing very, very nicely. You can even park the queen on d6. Quite a grip on the position. It can be evicted, but it's still quite an uncomfortable position for black to have. So if we go back to this position where d6 was played, so knight e7 doesn't seem to be that good, and you might think, well, knight f6, here queen takes d4. After castles e5, this offers a good advantage for white. Again, just taking this pawn on b4. So Spassky's move is actually, so d6, trying to do something perhaps with this bishop, giving himself some squares. And then we see knight takes d4. Okay, and this is quite tricky. If knight f6 here, there's new possibilities with knight c6. If queen d7, knight takes b4, again, white is standing very, very nicely in this position after, say, castles knight d5. So, okay, knight takes d4. If knight c6 perhaps was one of the reasons why queen d7 was played here, it might not be the best, but it's actually quite a difficult position for black. You might think there's a natural move here in terms of queen b6, and this is a fantastic dynamic line which you may never have seen before, even if you've seen this game. There's a very dynamic engine line here for knight d2, temporarily sacking a piece, which seems to work out very well indeed. For example, bishop takes d4, knight c4, bishop takes f2, king h1, queen moves. Now knight takes d6 check, king e7, if king f8, rook f1 there. Now queen f3, and white is actually doing fantastically well in this position. So for example, queen takes d6, queen takes f2. Look at this huge bishop on this diagonal. f6, and white can blast open the center, and this will have horrible consequences for black. This is quite a crushing position. So after knight takes d4, the natural queen b6 does seem to fall to knight d4 rather spectacularly. So we see actually queen d7, now knight d2. Anyway, this knight c4 is a very powerful idea, and in fact there's also a tactical threat of knight b6. That pawn is pinned as well. Perhaps against this bishop b7 seems quite logical in advance of knight c4. So knight c4, pardon me, knight c4, there's no threat of knight b6 here. Knight h6 is played in this position. What else is there? If we try a natural move, I think black's going to be blasted with e5, or even stronger. In fact, there's even stronger idea here, which is similar to the game idea. Can you guess what white could play in this variation if I give you 10 seconds starting from now? Actually, even stronger than the pattern of the game. Give yourself 50 points if you found knight e6. This is a real engine crushing move, I believe. So if queen takes e6, then we just take here, and this is very, very nice for white. For example, rook g8, knight takes d6 check, horrible. So what else does black do here? If bishop takes b2, then knight takes d6 is prettily winning the queen. the knights have mated the king if it wasn't for queen takes d6. So this is horrendous. So very interesting that knight e7 is so crushed immediately with knight e6 in this position. And knight f6, does that have a horrible fate with it as well? On knight f6, knight takes d6 check is possible. If queen takes d6, e5, queen d5, okay, it threatens mate, but it's check here. E takes f6 check. And after king d8, white can play all sorts of things here to avoid being mated and keep being up. Knight b5, for example, and this is crushing. Again, this sort of position is absolutely horrendous for black. Absolutely horrendous. Losing material and position. So let's have a look. So after knight c4, a kind of lesser evil move was played. Black is already doing badly here out of the opening. This has been a fantastic choice of opening this wing gambit. And Spassky plays knight h6, but now this runs into another great tactical resource. Can you spot it if I give you 10 seconds starting from now? Okay, white has knight f5. Wow, look at that, d6 being targeted by both knights here. g7 is attacked from the bishop. You might think there's time for knight takes f5, but we've got the dreaded check, surely. If knight takes f5, let's rule that out. E takes f5 check, and that's terrible. f6, and this is just horrendous. After knight takes d6, rook e7 to follow is a disaster for black. So knight f5 is pretty crushing here for knight takes f5. So in the game we see bishop takes b2, probably a lesser evil move out of all alternatives is to play bishop takes b2. Pardon me, that keeps happening for some reason. Bishop takes b2. And now we see knight c takes d6 check. The king moves. Now knight takes h6, gaining the piece back and offering the exchange. Now can this exchange be taken? Well, black seems incredibly weak on the dark squares. If bishop takes a1, queen takes a1, attacking the rook. This is not very nice for black at all. If rook g8, for example, knight d takes f7, and white is threatening all sorts of nasty things in this position, including knight g5, or just simply taking on g8, or even getting the rook in with rook e3 to threaten horrible things like rook f3. So this is pretty disastrous for black's king safety. So if we go back after knight takes h6, this rook wasn't taken, just f6, trying to stabilize the position, give the king g7, keep the bishop on the board, covering some dark squares. But now we see knight d f7. White doesn't mind the queens coming off here. The pressure is relentless even after the queens come off. So queen takes d7, queen takes d1. What else can black try here? If queen c7, let's have a look. Rook b1, bishop c3. White can just take this rook. White stands better here because after queen takes e1, well, material up and still an attack, and these knights can actually get out, so help each other get out, so that's not trapped or anything. So let's go back. So in the game we see actually the queen offer accepted. Queen takes d1, rook a takes d1, and now this is very, very tricky indeed. What does black actually want to try here? The threat is rook d7. If he plays something like king g7, doesn't that just simply fail to perhaps rook d7? No, there's actually even stronger here. I'm not sure actually rook d7 is that effective. Rook d7, black would actually be in the driving seat with bishop c6, believe it or not. To try and this is to be avoided. Black's actually miles better there. This would have to be played accurately. Knight takes h8, and if king takes h8, rook d7 here, and this is nice for white. The exchange up, this is winning. So let's go back. So rook takes on d1. Black actually tried king e7, keeping cover of that d7 square. Now Fischer takes on h8, rook takes h8, and now another brilliant tactic is played here. White's really in the driving seat in this game. Can you see what Fischer played in this position? If I give you 10 seconds starting from now. Okay, White plays knight f5 check. He's driving the king to sort of block in the rook. And again, this horrible threat of rook d7, so it is taken. E takes f5. Now king f8 is horrendous, as well as king f7. If king f8, we just play check here, and we can actually just win the rook on at h8 now, like this, to be 2 exchanges up. So that's horrendous. So what else? If king f7, that just allows rook d7 check, and we just simply take on b7. That's enough to win the exchange up. And Black's rook is out of the game as well. So, okay, so in the game, we see Spassky sacrificing the bishop e5, allowing, of course, this f4. So it's going to be the exchange down. But can he use his passed pawns here, potential passed pawns? He plays rook c8. So f takes, and now for a moment, rook takes c2. Is there a glimmer of hope with these two connected passed pawns? Well, Fischer has a dangerous passed pawn here, the e pawn. He doesn't mind about g2 here, he just plays e6. Taking on g2 is irrelevant. If we just take on g2, White just plays king f1, of course. He doesn't want to be mated with rook g3. So king f1, and there's huge threats here to deal with. This is end of game with rook d7 check coming in. For example, if takes, we can just take the rook after this. If that's ignored, then something like rook c1 is crushing. Okay, so taking on g2 is irrelevant here. Black tries bishop c6, more in line with trying to stop White for rook d7 immediately. So we see rook c1, not minding Black's seemingly potentially dangerous passed pawns. They're quite some way off from being dangerous here. Rook takes c1, rook takes c1. Now Spassky tries king d6. Okay, we see rook d1 check, and the king comes out with an idea that the bishop wants to sacrifice itself, potentially just to try and get these two passed pawns going. That's the idea. Does it fail though? e7, a5. The pawns look quite dangerous. Rook c1. Is there enough time for this? Will these pawns prevail? Bishop d7. Well, Fischer plays now rook c5 check. He's encouraging the king to help herd the b pawn. So what's the idea of this? King d4, rook takes a5, b3. Is the king herding the b3 pawn? Is White in trouble? Rook a7, bishop e8, king f2 is potentially gonna have to be played if White wants to get the king out. But for the moment, rook b7, the king herds the pawn. Is this dangerous? Isn't Black just going to be a piece up here? If this rook has to sacrifice itself for that pawn, well, in this position we see king f2, and it becomes clear now that actually, hold on a sec, White's king is playing a great herding role all of a sudden. After king e3, this king has gone a long way to herd the b pawn, and in this particular position there's only the bishop standing in front of that pawn, and a move like king c2, well, White can perhaps play just king d4 and sacrifice the rook, and the game is very similar to this. After bishop f7 g4, we see king c2, and this idea is revealed that the rook can sacrifice itself after king d4, because White's king will become the herder of the e7 pawn. We see queening, takes king c5. This bishop simply cannot stop the king. After king c2, king d6, it's hopeless for Black here. Spassky actually resigned. white is threatening just king d7, e8. Now if bishop e8, then that's a weakness of the last move, not covering e6, and these pawns will just prevail here. For example, like this, king e6, and we just take this pawn, and then we just come back. This will do for f6 and f7. So white's passed pawns are prevailing, even though black is that bishop up. The king's just come far too far down the board away from helping this scenario. So Fischer was all the time in control there in this ending the exchange down, but Spassky had resigned earlier when it became clear about this. Okay, so king d6 around about here. So a fantastic game and a very dynamic treatment to play the wing gambit against in this Anti-Sveshnikov system. To follow that wing gambit didn't allow black an easy time in the centre with the two bishops at all. In fact, he had quite a crushing position. Fischer had quite a crushing position after just about 15 moves in this game. Comments or questions on YouTube? Thanks very much.